When discussing hip-hop's greatest producers, the same names always get mentioned. DJ Premier, J Dilla, Kanye West, Dr. Dre, and I can go on. But there's one producer who has as good a case as any of them, but rarely gets mentioned, and his name is Prince Paul. He's been in the game for over 40 years, producing multiple classic albums, repeatedly pushing the genre forward, and changing what hip-hop could be from that point on. With all that love that De La Soul has been getting lately, I've been going back and really looking at Paul's career, and I'm amazed. I'm not sure if people have forgotten his contributions to hip-hop already, or if they were never properly celebrated at all. But hip-hop only looks and sounds the way it is because Prince Paul was here. Prince Paul was born and raised in Amityville, New York, a suburb of Long Island. Being based in Long Island, it gave him an outsider's perspective of hip-hop culture, while still being close enough to be a part of the thriving hip-hop scene in the early 80s. He started collecting vinyl when he was just 5 years old, and by the time he was 10 he started DJing under the name DJ Ever Ready as a part of his Ever Ready crew, before changing his name to DJ Paul. In 1981, when he was just 14 years old, he performed a DJ set at the A.C.E Center in Amityville, and that helped him gain recognition in the local scene. By the time he was in 8th grade, he was already battling, DJing parties, and producing tapes with the legendary Biz Markie. He and Biz weren't even making official songs at the time. They were just playing around and having fun while learning how to make music together. While DJing a block party in Brooklyn when he was around 16 years old, he was approached by Daddy-O Stet, the leader of the group Stetsasonic, and soon Paul would become the group's DJ. As the youngest member of the group, none of the other members really respected him too much, so he had to earn his respect on the boards. The lack of creative trust in the Stetsasonic days would be key in shaping Paul's collaborative mindset later in his career, always making sure that everyone's creative ideas were heard and explored. Stetsasonic is known for being one of hip-hop's first groups to incorporate live instrumentation into their shows and recordings. They are one of the most important groups of the 80s, even though their influence may be overlooked these days. They released 2 albums in the 80s, with their sophomore effort, In Full Force, being an undeniable classic. Through Stetsasonic, Paul was able to tour with Def Jam, playing Madison Square Garden and all of the biggest stadiums while still a teenager. But even with this, he still never thought that he would be able to continue doing music for his career. He only made around $600 for their first album, so he needed a plan B, and even toyed with becoming a mailman, before eventually going to college to be an audio engineer. His training in audio engineering helped him become one of the more innovative producers in hip-hop. His middle school music teacher was Everett Collins, a former drummer of the Isley Brothers, and Collins went on to produce Paul to Maceo of De La Soul. When Maceo introduced him to Posdnuos and Dave, De La Soul was already formed, and they enlisted Paul to be their guide in making an album. Paul helped them make a 2-song demo tape, and they eventually got signed to Tommy Boy Records. After being the little brother in Stetsasonic, Paul was now the veteran of his own group, and he took full advantage of this, exploring all of his and his group members' wildest ideas, helping De La Soul's debut album 3 Feet High and Rising become one of the most innovative albums in the history of music. Paul produced a majority of this project, and his personality is oozing from the entire thing. One thing about Paul is that he's hilarious, and a straight up wacky dude, so this album has the feel of something that hip-hop had never seen. This album is also credited with inventing skits in hip-hop music, and that's all Paul. So every time a rapper takes a break on their album with a skit or an interlude, you can blame Paul for that. On this album he was more of a facilitator, helping the De La Soul trio create what they were capable of. But for their second album they asked him to become an official member. De La Soul is Dead was released in 1991, and expands on everything great from the first album, while somehow being more experimental. Around this time, Russell Simmons of Def Jam asked Paul to start his own label under the Def Jam umbrella. Paul, being the knucklehead that he is, used this opportunity to start up a record label called Doo Doo Man Records. It may be hard to believe, but Doo Doo Man wasn't quite the hit that Russell Simmons hoped it would be. Paul signed a group of his friends under the group name Resident Alien and released a single, but after Def Jam wouldn't release the album, the whole Doo Doo Man experiment was scrapped and Paul was dropped from Def Jam. This was one of the lowest points of his career, and feeling at his lowest, he decided to call up some of his talented friends who were also at the rock bottom. Fruquan, who was a part of the now defunct Stetsasonic with Paul, Too Poetic, who had recently had a project fall through with the group The Brothers Grimm, and the RZA, who had just launched a failed solo career under the name Prince Rakeem. Paul put these 4 artists together to form the group The Gravediggers, one of the definitive horrorcore groups of all time, and one of the greatest hip-hop groups of the 90s. At this time, Paul and De La Soul were getting ready to release their last album as a quartet. Balloon Mind State is an amazing album, but you can hear the start of De La Soul maturing out of the goofiness that Paul brought to the table on their earlier albums. Paul did begin to work with the group on their 4th album, Stakes is High, but they ended up dropping him from the group in the early stages of production. This brings us to another one of the low points of Paul's career. After being dropped from his group, Paul felt like he had no more friends in the industry and saw the end of his career on the horizon, so he decided to make the album that would end his career. With no friends and no budget, he was going to have to go out on his terms and make an album that was for nobody but himself. Psychoanalysis was released in 1996 and is the first time that Paul was able to make an album that is fully unleashed and only his. This album is weird, experimental, and just kinda awesome, bending expectations and being one of the most underappreciated instrumental projects in hip-hop. This album didn't really do much financially, but it did set him up for his next 3 moves in the industry. First, this album got him a call from Chris Rock, who dug the album and wanted Paul to produce his next comedy album. Prince Paul ended up producing 3 albums for Chris Rock, and they actually won Grammys for all 3 of them. And I know what you're thinking, how much production is there really on a comedy album? Well, these weren't just stand-up. It was comedy mixed with skits, mixed with full-on songs and spoofs. It's really cool going back to listen to these now because there's really nothing like it today.
Holy calamity, scream insanity! All you ever gonna be's another great fan of me.
The second door that Psychoanalysis opened up for Paul was him linking up with Dan the Automator, who produced a remix track for Psychoanalysis. Dan and Paul would go on to form the group Handsome Boy Modeling School. In this group, Paul would play the part of Chest Rockwell in an attempt to completely reinvent himself. Paul and Dan bonded over their enjoyment of the Chris Elliott Show and would go to the video store together to get the weirdest videos possible to inspire their creativity. To create their first album, they would literally play each other samples and ask, "Does this sound handsome?" The duo released 2 albums together, both of them incredibly unique and straight up handsome as hell, and they even have teased a 3rd collaboration in the works now. And the last great thing that Psychoanalysis got us was that it opened the door back up for Paul to work with Tommy Boy Records again. Which brings us to the most important solo record of his career, Prince Among Thieves. This album is one of the greatest concept records in hip-hop history. In fact, Paul literally describes it as a movie on wax. Paul produced the entire thing, wrote a script, and then cast a bunch of talented MCs to play the characters in the story. This project features Kool Keith, Biz Markie, Big Daddy Kane, Exhibit, De La Soul, the incredible Breeze Bruin as the story's lead, and many more amazing talents. He originally had the idea to do a movie on wax back in 1991, in the Doo-Doo Man days, and when he ended up completing the album years later for Tommy Boy, the label didn't even know what to do with it, and it ended up sitting on a shelf for a year before finally being released. Just like many of Paul's albums, this one was not fully appreciated until years later, but now looking back, I think this may be one of his greatest achievements. Since it's kinda hard for a label to promote a movie on wax, Tommy Boy didn't give their full push to support the album, and Paul felt kinda slighted by this. So to retaliate, Paul followed up this project with Politics of the Business, his attempt to satirize mainstream hip-hop. This album was less sample-based than anything that Paul had made before, and he said that it's his least favorite album due to its bitter energy. But this thing is still underrated in my eyes. It features a star-studded group of artists including Dave Chappelle, Eric Sermon, Guru, Master Ace, Planet Asia, Cardinal Official, Chuck D, Ice-T, The Beatnuts, Jean Grey, MF Doom, Wordsworth, and Chubb Rock, who is hilariously on a song called Chubb Rock, Please Pay Paul His $2,200 You Owe Him, which unfortunately was never paid. He remixed this album 14 years later, calling it The Redux, redoing the production to make it sound a little more timeless and Paul-like, so definitely check that out if you're interested. In 2005, Paul released yet another dope concept record with Instrumentals, which essentially was a spoof of Law and Order type shows, this time focusing on the MVU, the Mental Victims Unit, tracking down and arresting Prince Paul. And then later that year he gave us a compilation tape called Hip Hop Gold Dust, containing unreleased songs from throughout his career. And that's just the thing about Paul's career. I've just been rattling off the greatest hits so far. I haven't even mentioned the many great songs that he produced for other artists, or even the many side projects that he's produced with other artists and groups. I had mentioned Resident Alien, his planned first group on Doo Doo Man Records. Well, he produced their album It Takes a Nation of Suckers to Let Us In, which was later released as a free download. In the mid-90s, he also produced an album with Amityville rapper Superstar called Horror City. He produced the MC Paul Barman EP called It's Very Stimulating. He even put out an album with his son, DJ P For Real, in 2012. He, Mr. Len, Mr. Dead, and Don Newkirk became a group called The Dicks, which was a fictional spoof of 50s doo-wop groups, and together they released the EP called The Art of Picking Up Women. He produced much of the 2009 Souls of Mischief album, Montezuma's Revenge, and in 2016 he formed a Brazilian hip-hop fusion group called Brookzilly, and they released an album called Throwback to the Future. He made a kids hip-hop album with the group Dino 5, and even at one point was working with Cartoon Network on creating a show called Kid Squad, about the misadventures of a group of kids who had a hip-hop group. In 2020, he and Don Newkirk reunited again to form the group Lord Brothers, and produced the album By Any Means Necessary, which served as the soundtrack to the Netflix documentary Who Killed Malcolm X. And I even read that Paul is working on the soundtrack to an upcoming Biz Markie documentary, that hopefully will be coming out soon. Of every legendary hip-hop producer, none of them have explored every avenue of their creativity, quite like Paul did. Prince Paul is 56 years old, and hip-hop turns 50 this year, and Paul is still making hip-hop like they're both in their teens. When looking at his career, there is a freedom that I rarely see in hip-hop these days. Every Prince Paul album is something that couldn't have came from the mind of any other artist, and he's left his mark on hip-hop forever. Thanks for watching, everybody. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Prince Paul is one of my favorite producers of all time, so drop your favorite Prince Paul beat down in the comments. As always, thank you to the patrons. They just voted on our next video, which will be a Ghostface Killer documentary, so stay tuned for that. If you want to vote for a video topic next month, make sure to check out the Patreon at the link below. The second issue of Def Magazine is coming next month, so make sure you guys are checking out my Twitter and Instagram for updates. As always, I got a lot more headed your way, so stay tuned, stay safe, and stay def. Thanks for watching.